There's still a whole lot of vulnerabilities that are taking place. And I think we have to still assume that most organizations at some point are going to be compromised. And now it's about how quickly you can respond rather than whether or not you're being compromised, how quickly you can contain and what your response actions are as soon as you detect something.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Joining me today is Thomas Kinsella, co-founder of Tynes, who is based in Ireland, if you can't already tell from your accent. So Thomas, thanks for joining. I'm really excited to have you here today. I actually really like what you guys are doing. And on that note, I think I saw something in the media yesterday that you guys did a major Series A or Series B capital raise. So well done. And it's good to see companies that are not necessarily perhaps in your mainstream areas like United States really coming into the foreground.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be on, and thanks for highlighting the news. Yeah, it's a great piece of news, great achievement for the company. We've been working really hard over the last 18 months, growing our customer base, improving the product, hiring a load of people on the team. It's not an amazing environment out there for startups, so it's a real testament to some of the work that the team have been doing that we've managed to raise some money. But realistically, it's just exciting to be able to get back and actually focus on making sure our customers are successful. But yeah, we're delighted with the news.
Well done. That's not an easy achievement, especially in this climate. So I want to start from your perspective. When we caught up a few weeks ago, we spoke about the future of operations. So in respect to your standard, Active Directory, on-prem and automation, talk to me a little bit more about this. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing? Yeah,
I think it's probably important to baseline a little bit on where I think operations are at the moment, and then talk about the future of security operations. I think there's some challenges that security as an industry has had for the last couple of years that are still definitely true. So we're still facing a huge shortage of security talent. There's still millions of jobs out there that are unfilled, and a huge opportunity for anybody to get into the industry, and we need to do a lot better at that. We're still facing too many alerts. So the vast majority of security teams have a bunch of tools. Not all of them talk to each other. And they're facing a challenge of, even when they turn on a good tool, that it's hard to stay on top of all of the work. There's still a whole lot of vulnerabilities that are taking place. And I think we have to still assume that most organizations at some point are going to be compromised. And now it's about how quickly you can respond rather than whether or not you're being compromised, how quickly you can contain and what your response actions are as soon as you detect something. I think there's a few other things that that are still definitely true as well. So I think most people are realizing that, just looking at dashboards isn't security. But when we're thinking about the future, there's a whole lot of paradigm changes that are taking place now and that have taken place over the last few years. First of all, a lot of companies are moving towards the cloud. So whether it's migrating on-prem assets into the cloud or building a brand new company with a cloud first strategy, I think spending on cloud security services is expected to increase 30-40% year over year, which is absolutely enormous. And most organizations, the vast majority, are using cloud services, whether it's a Okta or whether it's AWS. And I think in terms of the future, we're just not good at responding to those cloud security alerts just yet. So when I think about, I suppose, where security is going, I think we're continuing to get more and more data. We're continuing to get to deal with the challenges of not enough people. We're continuing to deal with some of the challenges of too many alerts. So I think we have to, I suppose, change the way we're approaching security. And the future is going to be there's some certain things that are going to be non-negotiable. First of all, every security team is going to be a partner to the business. Things like two-factor authentication are going to be mandatory. Security awareness is always going to be there, etc. We absolutely have to focus on the risk assessments. But I really think that security is going to move towards a much more operational model. So what I mean by that is that it's no longer possible to triage absolutely every single alert manually. We're moving away from a model where every single alert, goes into a ticket and then you can just, view it and then a human being says yes or no. I think you're going to have to correlate absolutely everything. So data is already eating the world, but data is going to be where it's at. And then similarly, I think everything is going to be measurable. So as I said, moving more towards operations, it's no longer about, hey, did we detect this? It's going to be, there's a new vulnerability about. The metrics are going to be how quickly you can respond, how quickly you can write a new detection, what percentage of your assets are going to be covered by that. And yeah, I think we're gonna see companies struggle to stay on top of some of these new paradigms. But there's a huge opportunity for people. There's a lot of really, really smart folks out there. It's just a challenge that we're going to have to face as an industry.
So you raise a good point around cloud security alerts, and you said we're not really good at handling that. Why do you think that is? Is it because there's just so many that it's just infinite and we can't deal with it, or what's the reasoning?
I don't think that it's so many that we can't deal with it. I think that as an industry, there's been some organizations that have moved, towards the cloud, but we just haven't developed that, I suppose, that shared knowledge of what best practice is. So if you go to a security conference, you can learn a lot about the latest attacks, the latest breaches. You'll read a ton and you'll hear a ton about the Optus breach or the Uber breach. But what you won't hear a lot of is, I think, around some of the much more challenging parts of like securing your cloud environment. You'd much more likely to hear a talk or a presentation about here's how you secure your Active Directory, or here's how you secure your on-prem exchange, or here's the latest type of malware that's running PowerShell or something like that. You're way less likely to hear a talk and way less likely to hear other folks talk about cloud security misconfigurations, or talk about, hey, here's how we secure our S3 buckets in AWS. And I think people are very comfortable. People have trained, people have gotten degrees in forensics, degrees in security, and those haven't caught up. So people are still super familiar and super comfortable talking about those, I suppose, older style environments. And then I think we just haven't focused as, there's plenty of startups that are doing a great job, but we just haven't focused as much on saying this is actually just as critical. The attack surface has expanded to the cloud because we don't have a lot of experts that have done it in 2 or 3 different companies. There's not that depth of experience where people are able to share their knowledge and kind of make it more common, make it more accepted. The other part about it is still very new. So I think people don't have experience of dealing with every single type of alert as they would in kind of an old environment. And there's not as much, training grounds where you can see exactly what an alert would look like. So with standard malware reverse engineering or something like that, or with threat intel, you can say, hey, have I seen this IP address? Or what would this alert look like if, or what would a detection look like if I execute this malware on this particular device in this particular sandbox? Would my detections or would my team be able to pick this up? That's not the same. There's no real sandboxes out there right now which are saying, hey, your EC2 instance hasn't been secured properly or has misconfigured permissions, or maybe that, your disk hasn't been encrypted and therefore you've got some other risk. Or maybe your public storage or your storage buckets are public. It's not something that people are training on. It's not something people are thinking about as much. You can accidentally reveal your entire AWS infrastructure by just leaving a key out there. And I think that's just not as much of a paradigm these days.
Yeah, that's fair. I understand what you're saying. And I guess it's going to be maturation of the industry until we have sort of stock standard ways of doing things or best practice. What do you think from your perspective and your opinion on best practice? Do you have any sort of do you have a view on it, or to how to go about it at a high level?
Yeah, I think the very first thing, as always, we should be looking into our people. There are plenty of good tools and there's plenty of good courses, but we should be training up our team to say hey, this is how you do it, or these are some courses, or this is I suppose a baseline of what we can do. There are actually great tools out there, both public and private. But for a lot of these, for AWS, for GCP, for Google Cloud Security Posture, and for AWS, we've got Guard Duty. You just should absolutely be turning these things on at a minimum, when you're starting, and absolutely observing those alerts. It's not so much making sure that everything is secure or detecting a breach. It's more at this point, knowing a little bit more about your environment, poking around in it and seeing what sort of misconfigurations there are, and making sure that your security team are aware of it, and then they can push the information to the engineering team. So if you've got, if you don't have any logs stored for 6 months and an incident occurs, the same as in a kind of standard kind of behind your firewall environment, you're not going to be able to detect anything, or you're not going to be able to understand what happened. But right now, you need to know if somebody has stood up an incident or stood up an EC2 instance that is misconfigured, or if somebody stood up an S3 bucket that's public, or if that bucket isn't encrypted. And the way you can do that is there's a bunch of tools that you can just plug in and they'll start telling you about these misconfigurations instantly. Tools like Lacework or Wiz or Orca will say, hey, we've detected some suspicious traffic to an IP address for the very first time, or somebody has logged into this device for the very first time. And at this point, I don't even, for a lot of security teams, I don't even think it's It's about, detecting bad. It's about knowing what a baseline is so that you can start understanding a little bit more about that environment. And then you can start, those next steps. I don't think auto remediation is something you should be immediately thinking about in security or in the cloud right now either. But it is something that you can very much, or like auto contacting or auto creating tickets is definitely something that you can do, where you're contacting somebody and saying, hey, we noticed you just logged into this device for the very first time, or we noticed an ad like sudo was run on this particular box for the very first time. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Was that deliberate? So I think that the first step is just, trying to become a little bit more familiar with that environment, logging, turning on those really basic detections or basic tools so that you become more familiar with it. And then getting more comfortable with, just contacting users and understanding and making sure that your engineering team are comfortable with talking to you and know that you're detecting and know that you're able to help them when standing up some of these environments as well.
So would you say, Thomas, that people out there don't know much or anything about their cloud environment? So I mean, it's sort of me not knowing where the kitchen is in my apartment that I live here in. So I'm just curious to know, why is that the case?
Yeah, I think we've met in many ways. I wouldn't say there's plenty of organizations that are doing an extremely good job at securing this. And there's a whole lot of security companies who've raised funding and are doing a great job at, I suppose, enabling people to get a handle of their estate very, very quickly. And, when you plug them in, turn them on, you're able to, your dashboard will light up with alerts. I think it's more though that, there are a whole lot of organizations that aren't considering it as a completely separate attack surface and aren't as concerned, or maybe not as concerned, maybe aren't as aware that it's just as vulnerable. I think to answer your question though, I think there are probably a lot of organizations that don't have the barrier to entry to spinning up a new environment is very, very small. So you can, anybody can go in and sign up for an AWS account and start serving data. So that's exactly what it was designed for, right? So that somebody could get started really quickly. The challenge is that, in this day and age when people are getting pressure from the business to move very fast, that you can move very fast. And whereas previously you'd have to stand up hardware in order to stand up a product or stand up a website or something like that, nowadays you can spin up an account, start serving data to customers immediately, and you haven't taken those steps to secure that. So I think the ability for anybody in the organization to stand up something really quickly without securing it is really hard. But the second part about it is, because you're moving very quickly, you may not know about your estate. So we all know about, shadow IT. Everybody has heard of that second Slack instance if, you're using Teams, or the use of whatever DocuSign if you're using HelloSign or something like that, because people think it's easier. It's the same in cloud, right? That people are prepared to stand up their completely separate environments that were originally test. They actually look great. All of a sudden, that gets moved up. The discussions around securing that aren't happening. I think that's part of the whole shift left movement, though, or the whole shift left ideology, that realistically security should be involved at the very start of pretty much every project. That you need to understand how things are being set up. You need to understand how, what your engineering teams or what your product teams' plans are, so that you can bake in those security controls and understand, actually, you shouldn't be setting this up, or you need our help in setting this up, or we need to lock it down, or we've got a centralized account which has all these policies. So therefore, you're automatically not going to be able to make some of the mistakes that somebody else has made in the past. So if security get involved, at the design stage, then making a lot more progress, and you're shifting some of the problems from, an incident to a simple design decision. When it's gone down the road of this environment's already stood up, it's already talking to customers, and then you're told, oh, actually you need to, change the architecture, then you're in, I'm not going to say massive trouble, but you're facing a much bigger challenge.
Do you think as well, so hypothetically, talking about shadow IT or just spinning up a cloud environment, just say I'm working in an organization, I do something I'm not supposed to do, or I'm doing something that no one really knows about, and then I leave and it's just sort of sitting there and no one knows about it. Do you find a lot of cases like that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that, again, that's shadow IT, but that happens in every sort of environment where, somebody has written a script, unbeknownst to everybody else, it's supporting a lot of the company or a reasonably critical process, but it hasn't been, checked into a Git repo. So it's not actually formally supported or formally scanned, or nobody knows exactly what it's doing. Yeah, that definitely happens in the cloud, where there's some organizations that have spun up separate environments that are doing one or two things. I think that the examples that I've heard about and been involved in myself are things like it's not important, it's non-core, it's only the marketing side. The marketing side isn't super important. If it gets compromised, there's not much customer data that's on there. But it turns out the marketing site's able to accept credit cards, or it turns out that the marketing site, is where people are redirected to after something's happened. So you've got, referral logs and things like that. So there can be definitely instances where, yes, smaller projects that are stood up that seemingly don't matter as much, but that are actually, very critical to the organization. And the other part about it is that, as you say, like that scope can increase, right? So it can just be originally set up as a small project. So nothing too important. We don't need to go through the formal security process. And then all of a sudden it becomes a lot more important because at one point somebody needs to move very fast. And even though it was in that separate environment and it didn't follow our security controls, it was in DigitalOcean instead of AWS or Azure. And now all of a sudden it's being used for something a little bit more important. But we do see those environments get set up. Or test environments that contain real customer information when they shouldn't, or they're left, they should be deleted and they're not. And you'll see incidents that are related to that reasonably frequently as well. Again, I don't think there's anything malicious about what anybody's doing. I think it's just not good enough guidelines for organizations, and security, unfortunately, not getting involved early enough in the process.
So as a manager or an executive or someone listening to this and they're like, oh, you can't really physically have the control that you'd like over, all of your employees. You can't necessarily lock everything down, or you don't have oversight into every single thing that they're downloading or that they're creating or that they're spinning up, or, people have got BYODs now, they've got air-gapped machines, they're off network potentially if they're doing like, red teaming and stuff like that. How do people sort of get some level of control? Because a lot of the time, which is what you've just sort of said, is it's not everyone's intention to have these things as sitting out there, but, people forget or people move on, people get fired, they don't know that they just had this test environment that's sitting out there with customer data in it, and all of a sudden we got a breach. How do people handle this?
I've been at plenty of conferences recently where I'm talking to a whole lot of CISOs who have similar challenges. I think the answer, well, first of all, there's no easy answer, but I think the role of the CISO, the role of those managers or directors, involves a lot more communication rather than building out the program. So it involves like partnering with the engineering team, partnering with the IT team, and talking to them and building those relationships so that they feel comfortable coming to you. A lot of the time, security is seen as the bad guy in the room, the bad cop, where we come and been involved in enough of these incidents when working in industry where we're like, what just happened? We need to like lock this down immediately. Like, how is it possible that we allowed this to happen? Whereas if we come instead with a little bit more, again, of an operational model of, hey, this happens and it's not good, but we know that this is going to happen. We know that this is not the first time. People are going to become a little bit more comfortable with talking about it and saying, actually, hey, I need a little bit of help with this. So this is bad, but I'm okay with talking about it. So I think like building those relationships very early on, and if you bust them and that happens as well, just reaching out and trying to improve them so that nobody feels bruised by their interactions with security. I've had plenty of incidents where somebody reports a phishing email or somebody reports that they've clicked on a link or that they've downloaded some software. And oftentimes you're able to detect or you're able to lock that system down. But what's really valuable about that is when, as a next step, you go and see, did anybody else do something, or did anybody else receive that same email? And in plenty of occasions, you will see that other people have. So by encouraging and having an open and honest conversation with folks saying like, hey, it's okay, I want you to report. It's more valuable to me that you tell me that something has gone wrong, or that you tell me that you suspect that something is not secure now, rather than me finding out about it in 2 months' time or 3 months' time when actually I find out about it on Twitter. So if you make it so that people feel comfortable talking to you, people feel comfortable disclosing things to you, and part of your job is cleaning up these environments, like saying, hey, it's okay, we can migrate this, and there's not a turn this off immediately, we're going to like disrupt the business, but coming into it with a much more partnership attitude. You're going to find that people are reasonable as well. Nobody wants to be the reason for something bad happening to your organization. So as a result, I think people will be, in my experience, people will be a lot more open if security is a proper partner to the business, concerned about not just their stress levels when an incident happens, but actually concerned about the top line with business reality.
Would you say historically security hasn't been, looked upon as a partner? And I say this because I've been in that position before where everyone's like, oh, you're security, you're here to tell me what I can't do. And then I almost think that because, unfortunately, people can go around and say, oh, well, you can't do that, Thomas. And then all of a sudden you end up doing it anyway. It's almost like when you're a teenager and your parents like, no, you can't go to that party, and then you sneak out and then you go, right? Because you're like, well, stuff you, I'm doing it anyway. So do you think there's a little bit of that in there because they may be sick to death of people coming around, acting like the police, acting like they run the whole show, and then as a result, they feel angry and annoyed because you're holding up their project or whatever it is, and then they just end up doing what they want to do anyway?
Yeah, 100%, right? Like that, I think that's happened with like every security organization. And it's really hard to change that because as a security professional, when you see something going wrong or when an incident occurs, the next week or 2 weeks or month is going to be really hard. And it's not just hard on you, it's hard on your team, it's hard on your peers and on your reputation as well. Most security folks it won't affect them too badly, but at the same time, it's hard to see when that incident happens, especially when there's an element of we knew this was going to happen. But yeah, like if you approach somebody and you scold them, you're definitely not going to get the best response out of them. Instead, as you've identified, coming at it with saying like, actually, hey, here's a suggestion, and then shifting left in that environment. So getting involved in that process earlier on and making sure that you're being very reasonable about it. Like at some point, ultimately, every single thing's a risk, but security is part of the business. It's a risk-based decision. At some point, somebody is going to say, you know what, we don't need two-factor authentication here because it's going to slow us down too much. Or maybe it's okay to take this small risk that something bad is going to happen here. Or we need to move really fast and we can secure something later. And that's okay as well. Security has to be comfortable with that. But if security comes in, if the team come in with an absolute attitude of saying no, yeah, you're just going to rub people up the wrong way. And yeah, it doesn't help anybody. It burns those bridges. And yeah, security doesn't come out looking better. In reality, you're going to be more secure if you come with that more collaborative attitude. And it's not to say that saying no isn't the right call in some circumstances. It's more to say that, yeah, if you want to build up those relationships, you have to come with a much more practical business first approach.
So where do you think this scolding sort of business came from, this behavior? Why do you think people historically have gone around and scolded people? I mean, like, oh, you did that wrong, Tom. Like, where does that come from?
I think from a security point of view, it's a little bit born out of frustration, but it's also born out of the hope or the misguided hope that people will follow those rules if you tell them strictly, you absolutely have to do it this way. Yeah, from a security practitioner point of view, it is really hard when that incident happens. And if you know that something is going to go wrong, or you predict that something's going to go wrong with a reasonable likelihood, you're going to freak out, may not be the word, but you're going to that there's going to be some pain. So you're going to shout from the rooftops about it. But again, you have to overcome that and say, actually, this is something that we're comfortable with bringing you to the table and like having a reasonable conversation and not telling you to do this, but rather everybody realizing that everybody is on the same page. There's nobody that wants an organization to be breached. Everybody wants what's in the best interest of the company. So yeah, I think if you look at, security awareness training, it's really interesting when you look at some of the stats around those organizations that punish people for clicking on those links. First of all, people are going to click on links anyway. At some point, people are going to make those mistakes. So being absolute about it, it doesn't help the situation where anybody who clicks on a link gets fined or anybody who clicks on a link is not eligible for a monthly or an annual bonus. I've heard of that happening in some extremely large organizations. But instead, encouraging people to report, encouraging gamifying and encouraging people to hey, this is the reason that we're doing this, and making it part of their role where they're thinking about security. And then encouraging them, highlighting the wins, not the reason we didn't get breached, but we were able to prevent this as a result of this particular thing happening. So somebody patched, and we've seen other organizations get compromised, highlighting that and saying, thank you so much for patching, or thank you so much for reporting. Thank you so much for putting in place these policies. That's how you're going to win. That's how you're going to win friends and make sure that your organization stays secure. But I think scolding comes from frustration and probably comes from a little bit of fear of what's going to happen.
So it's repeatedly saying, no, Joanne, you can't do that. No, Joanne, no, Joanne. And then eventually there's okay, then they start to get upset because on the 20th time, I've told you can't do it that way because of these reasons. And this is what we're trying to do in terms of protecting the asset or the whatever it is, the company. And then eventually I think people start to lose maybe manners and they start to become impatient because they've gone over things so many times and people just aren't listening.
Yeah, and saying instead, like, hey, Joanne, talk to me a little bit more about what you're trying to achieve. What are you trying to do here? Like, what's your aim? What are you working on? And getting to her head and saying, okay, this is important. And we understand why you want to do this. We understand you're expecting this invoice, and that's why you're clicking on this link or you're downloading this file or you're setting up this environment. Here's a way of doing this security, and we can help you do that, and we can train you to do that. It'll take more time in the short term because you're going to be spending time with Joanne. But in the long term, Joanne's going to think of security not as the bad guys, but rather as a partner, and will hopefully then the next time she's standing up an environment or she's downloading something, think a little bit more about it and say, actually, maybe I should get in touch with security. But yeah, saying no to somebody, it doesn't endear you to them.
So it's how you frame it, I would say. So maybe that's where people historically have gone wrong in the past, of not actually framing like, hey, like, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to do? Let me help you, rather than like, no, you can't do that. Because no one enjoys that.
Nope, nobody enjoys it. Not even the security team, though. It's not a fun experience being on the other end either, because you're rubbing people up the wrong way and they're not going to react positively. But there is nothing like the feeling of getting those detections or preventing an incident as a result of partnering. That's a great feeling. That's security analysts, security engineers. They feel emboldened when that happens, but they also feel it's a little bit of a security is a mission, right? You're never secure. You're only securing. And they feel when you get those wins, it's very rare you get those wins, but when you get those wins, it's a great feeling and it's a testament to the work that they're doing. So being able to showcase the wins, it's really important for the morale of the security team as well, that they're not just the defenders. It's really hard being on the defense all the time. It's really hard just trying to prevent. If you're able to proactively take away some of the challenges of your team, and if you're able to proactively prevent those incidents or put in place better processes, you're going to feel like your job is a lot more worthwhile and that it's getting better, you're improving, you're actually making a more impactful risk reduction effort in your organization, which is great. That's what every security professional actually wants to do. They want to reduce that risk. They want to add value. They don't just want to say no. I don't think that's what anybody signs up to do.
So if we zoom out, so we've spoken about the tools that you've mentioned before and best practice. We've spoken about how to have the right conversations internally, like what to sort of start saying versus stop saying. And we spoke a little bit more about getting further alignment around security being in the conversation early. What other advice would you have as well if you want to sort of look at securing the cloud holistically? Do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
I think it's like in terms of securing the cloud, yeah, but it's also just in terms of security more generally, that it's a really hard environment right now to like hire and retain good people on the team. As I said, there's millions of security jobs out there where somebody can move to. So if you've got people that are like saying no all the time, or if you've got people who are just detecting bad all the time, they're not necessarily growing in their career, and they may very well just, be overwhelmed and decide to move on to another organization. So I think we have to look at this like security programs and make sure that we're treating the teams and the individuals kind of correctly. And unfortunately, as we talked about before, a lot of analysts do get burned out. So I think there's a few different things that we can do about it. But it's when you ask them, and at times we've done some surveys around this, and plenty of other organizations have done some surveys as well. But I suppose part of the reason that people feel burned out is that they are dealing with a constant change in technologies, and they are dealing with way too many alerts. So I think giving people a little bit more time where they're able to focus on the fun stuff. So focus on actually building new detections. So making detection and triage fun again, but also enabling them to, automate some of their workloads where they are able to like get away from that mundane response. That'll help your environment stay more secure, but it'll help the analysts and the engineers be more fulfilled in their jobs so that they'll add value to the organization, and they'll feel much more productive, and they'll feel much more valued members of the team.
Okay, I want to press on this a little bit more. I have been seeing things recently coming out around the fatigue, the burnout across any sort of security discipline. But you spoke before about like alert fatigue, for example, but then you also then spoke about the broader sort of the challenges on the burnout. So if I'm a leader, what sort of conversations should I be having with my analysts, with my staff, to ensure that, they aren't leaving straight away? And I guess much to your point around the new technologies as well, actually, when I'm thinking about it, you said they're just sort of changing technologies all the time. Is that because they're getting a better tech, or because they're swapping, or they're adding things to their stack, or why is that?
Yeah, it can be a little bit of everything, right? So it can definitely be because they're getting better tech, or it can be because they're suddenly setting up a cloud environment, or the IT team have changed Okta to one login or something like that. Or from Teams to Slack or Salesforce to HubSpot. And now all of a sudden you're dealing with trying to build out new detections for those environments. But I think when we talk to security leaders and we ask them like, hey, what do you think you should be doing? I think a lot of them are still focusing on the same metrics, right? So they're still focusing on mean time to response, mean time to remediate, mean time to investigate. But when you're trying to keep your team happy, it's not just about the number of alerts. You should be measuring team performance in terms of burnout, in terms of your employees' mental health as well. So like right now, not just for the employees, for you, if you've got one employee who's dealing with, 20% of the alerts on a 10-person team, they're clearly doing way more, but also you've got a potential single point of failure there if they're responsible for a certain type of alert that they're the only person that knows about it. But more burnout. So if somebody is not taking their time off, if somebody is like working all hours, so always working overtime, or if they're taking on like more tickets than anybody else, that's a leading indicator of churn. So the first thing is measuring some of, hey, like who's doing most of the work. The second is, I suppose, establishing a baseline of how many alerts are we able to actually deal with without our employees spending 100% of time on responding to alerts or spending 100% of their time on tasks that aren't necessarily as fulfilling. And then measuring the time off that they're taking, establishing like one-on-one rituals where you're checking in with them, making sure that they're doing okay, making sure that they feel supported. And then when you establish that baseline, you can improve on it. I think the second thing that you have to do is you have to make the security team feel the fun. And some of that is that win where we were talking earlier with Joanne that like saying no to Joanne is not great. That's not a good experience. But saying yes to Joanne, saying like, hey, this is fab, and Joanne has come to you and proactively asked about something, like celebrating things like that, or making the triage process of this alert has come in. Let's see if we can figure out what mass spam campaign this phishing email corresponded to, or let's see if we can figure out more detections for this, or let's see if we can basically allow them to have more creative, high impact fun while working on those projects. Not always possible, definitely something that's done. But I think you need to like design your team, design your tools, design your processes around minimizing that bad aspect of that repetitive manual work and more on maximizing the great, that creative, kind of high impact fun work. And again, security automation can definitely play a part of that because you're allowing the analyst who's fed up of that process, but who knows that process cold, to get rid of it and allow them to focus on that much more fun aspect.
So would you say with the alert fatigue from an analyst perspective, because they are fatigued, perhaps they're missing things or things are going by the wayside or there's gaps because they sort of just, they're so used to it or they're seeing things all the time. Like it's sort of like if you're driving and they always say like you've got to stop every few hours because you're tired and you're fatigued, right? And that's how people end up having car accidents and dying because they're just that tired that it's just sometimes that their brain just isn't focused on potentially there being a risk in front of them or they fall asleep at the wheel or something like that. So it's like the same type of fatigue and risk is, no one's dying from things, I hope, but it's the same type of, I guess, cognitive ability towards the fatigue side of things.
Yeah, definitely. And it comes out in a few different ways. So obviously, as you said, it could just be that they don't recognize, like you use sudo in this particular situation for the first time. Like that's not particularly unusual that it's an engineer. So I'm absolutely fine. But then all of a sudden we see Steve do it, and Steve works in customer support. It's probably a little bit more unusual that they've used PowerShell or they've run something suspicious. So it's being able to gather that context or understand that context in your head is really important for that analyst. And if they're burned out, then it's going to be hard to do that. But the second part about it is that you're kind of making the point as to driving, that, when you're driving, you're using that second half of your brain. I think you usually don't make mistakes, but when you're tired, you definitely do, right? And it could just be that you typo something or you don't check that IP address or you just miss those 2 or 3 steps in the process that are actually really critical because you've got too many other alerts to deal with. So if you've done 5 or 10 different things, that context switching is always really hard. And humans are not great at just following that process time over time again. They'll try to find some optimizations, but they'll also like try to notice those patterns, even if they don't exist, or hopefully they do exist. But I think that when you have analysts that are burnt out, they're going to miss things. It's really put the blame on the analyst saying, I can't believe they didn't recognize this. But if an analyst doesn't recognize something or missed something in the process, it's because they're tired or because the process should be automated or because they haven't been trained properly or they just don't have enough time. And they say, actually, it's very likely this is a false positive. I've seen this alert 20 times. But sometimes you've got alerts that are designed to only be true positives 5% of the time. Somebody logging in from a suspicious IP address in the Middle East somewhere, if the company's based in Australia, it's very unlikely that if that happens, it's not just somebody either traveling through or on holidays in the Middle East, but 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 100 times that is bad. And as a result, it's the analyst may close that being, I'm way too many alerts. Likely that's a false positive. Whereas in reality, you should be following that process, contacting the user saying, hey, do you recognize this activity? Were you on holidays? Is that person on PTO in your HR system? That alert fatigue is when those alerts start getting missed. And that's when that breach can happen, unfortunately.
Wow. Okay. So we've started off with talking about cloud, and then we've sort of moved over to the analyst side of things. So alert fatigue, of course, changing multiple technologies and systems. Yes, I find that annoying and overwhelming myself. You got to learn a whole new system, which of course takes extra time to do things. And then when people are tired and they are fatigued, they miss things. And then when they miss things, we have errors. And then we have errors, we have breaches.
Yeah. Exactly. There's a whole lot of ways that you can solve those challenges, but it's up to security leaders to enable their team and to make sure that they're doing work that they feel valued for and that they're able to learn on the job, that they're able to grow on the job. And fortunately, really smart security leaders that are doing this and we can learn from that are doing it the right way and that are measuring the right things. So there's a lot of really good folks that are doing it. And I think belatedly, there has been a huge focus on it, which is great to see.
So in terms of measuring the right things, what are those things people should be measuring from your perspective?
I guess it depends on exactly what we're trying to accomplish. So I think when we're talking about the analyst and what they're doing, there's a few different things that you can be measuring. So obviously you should be measuring your mean time to detect, mean time to respond. You should be measuring things like how much time my analysts are taking. Are there too many analysts? Are there too many alerts that are being act by a particular analyst or by a particular engineer? Saying you should hopefully have a reasonable idea of your storage and your data feed health. Am I still receiving detections? Am I still receiving logs for this particular log source? Are my detections still working? Testing out your detections. But those metrics don't actually tell us if we're maturing and improving our security posture, I don't think. So I think we should also be measuring a whole load of other things around how useful are these detections or how useful are each author's detections. Obviously things standard enough, like how effective is our patching, what percentage of our bugs are actually known, but bugs are actually patched. But the things that I'd really be focusing on, and I think you have to be thinking about, is your speed to respond to those new attacks. So we've seen a brand new exchange vulnerabilities come out recently. Now that should be reasonably easy to say hey, are we vulnerable to this? But the question is hey, are we vulnerable? And if we imagine that maybe that's not quite exchange, but how fruitful or how quickly we can analyze our environment, compile that vulnerability and risk status, and then share it and understand, hey, how are we actually affected? And then the next question is how quickly in our environment can we build a new detection for that? So, mean time to detect, mean time to respond, that's fab. But the real question is when something comes along, how quickly can I accurately tell if I'm going to be affected? And then if I am going to be affected, how quick, or even if I'm not, how quickly can I build out a detection for that? There are two things that every CISO should know about. If we're moving fast and we're talking about earlier, kind of bringing it back, we detect that somebody is using a separate AWS instance or somebody, I don't know why they do this, but plenty of people do a separate Slack account for communications. The question is how quickly can you add a new log source to your environment? And then same other things hey, you get new detections or a new report of the IOCs that were involved in that Optus breach, for example. How quickly can we sweep our entire environment to see have we been infected by this across our workstations, across our servers, across our cloud environment? I think those are the metrics that if I'm trying to measure the success of my program, that I'd be really focused on trying to get a handle of. And then if you're being able to break it down even further by going into things for each domain or those exact same statistics, but for my front-facing assets or my DMZ or my crown jewels, etc. We have a lot of reasonable metrics, but you really want to know how quickly you can respond and how quickly your team can respond and how effective your team are able to operate when something goes right or something goes wrong.
So in terms of final thoughts or closing comments, do you have any sort of to share with our audience today? Thomas, I think you've been quite detailed in your response. I think we've looked at multiple angles as well, not just necessarily focusing on the technology itself, but also the behaviors in which people can start changing internally as well from a leadership perspective, but also as an employee level as well, and how we speak across our business. Is there anything you'd like to leave our audience with today?
The only thing I'll say is that there's a lot of people that are doing a great job, and I'll come on and I'll say, hey, here's what you should be doing. And just be a little bit wary of, not necessarily folks like me, but I suppose the kind of security Instagram influencer effect of, you'll hear a lot of people that are claiming to have these incredible detections or claiming that they're doing everything perfectly. It's not always the case. And there's no such thing as a silver bullet, but there's a lot of people that don't have an incredible security program and are just getting started. And that's okay. You are where you are. The whole point is the fact that you're listening to this podcast is absolutely fab, but you can just take those first steps. And those first steps are going to be building those relationships with your peers in other parts of the business. And then looking at your team and saying like, hey, how are they doing? How am I able to get the best use out of them? But don't be like put off by saying, oh, I'm so far behind. In many ways, there's plenty of organizations that claim to be doing an incredible job that aren't, or that are showcasing the absolute best, as most people on Instagram do. And just don't be afraid. It's okay. There's plenty of organizations out there. The security community is absolutely fab. If you want to reach out to me and have a chat about like security automation, we're more than happy to have that conversation. But also, there's a really good community and a lot of people will have your back if you approach them and are honest about the situation. The final thought is, even though I've shared a lot of, I hope not too scary things, but a lot of challenges that people are facing, there's a really positive future and there's great people in the security industry who are dealing with these challenges and helping people face them.
Well, the grass isn't always greener on the other side, as they say. So thanks very much, Thomas. Thanks very much for your time, for sharing your thoughts and your insights, and can't wait to get you back on the show.
Thank you for having me on. It's been great.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes.
This podcast is brought to you by MercSec, the specialists in security, search, and recruitment solutions. Visit mercsec.com to connect today.
If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.